Welcome back to Mr. Dreadmere tonight. I have 7 true winter horror stories. The blizzard stopped, but the footsteps kept going. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed, because once you step onto the Mr. Dreadmere, you don't walk alone. I was already halfway onto the lake when I realized the road markers were gone, and that made my stomach drop, because I was the one who put them there the night before. I stopped the snowmobile, killed the engine, and listened, expecting the usual creaking beneath the ice, but there was only a strange quiet that made my ears ring. I stepped off and walked forward, boots crunching. And that was when I saw the footprints cutting clean across the lake, a single line heading toward the center. They were fresh, too fresh. The storm had ended less than an hour earlier, and the wind had scarred everything flat. These prints hadn't drifted or softened. They looked pressed down deliberately, heel to toe, spaced like someone walking calmly, not slipping or rushing. I followed them without thinking, because that was my job, to check, to confirm, to make sure no one had wandered where they shouldn't. I kept telling myself it was probably a hunter or someone drunk, but the spacing bothered me. No hesitation, no slide marks. Whoever it was knew exactly where they were going. The path led straight toward the exclusion zone, the section of the lake everyone in Lovedalen knew not to cross. I'd grown up hearing stories about warm springs under the ice, about logging equipment lost there decades earlier. We marked it every season, and people respected it. I radioed in, but all I got was static. I decided to turn back, but when I looked behind me, my own tracks were already fading in places, blurred like they'd been there for hours. The footprints ahead stayed sharp. That scared me more than I want to admit. I took a breath and kept walking, telling myself I'd just go far enough to confirm where they ended. The ice started to feel different under my boots, not cracking, but softer somehow, like it was breathing. I slowed, crouched, and ran my glove over the surface. No water seeped up, but the cold felt wrong, deeper than it should have been. The footprints didn't slow or change. They went on straight and confident. About 50 steps from the center, I noticed something else. There was only one set of prints, no return path. That's when I felt like I was being watched, not from above, but from below. Like something under the ice was aware of me standing there. I stood up fast and almost slipped, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I shouted, asking if anyone was out there, my voice sounding thin and foolish. The sound didn't echo the way it should have. It felt swallowed. I took another step, then another until the prints ended, just stopped. No scuff, no stumble, no sign of breaking through, just empty ice. I stared at that spot for a long time, trying to understand it. I remember thinking maybe the person lay down, maybe they'd been dragged, but there was nothing. Then I noticed something beneath the ice, a darker shape, wide and indistinct, directly under where the footprints stopped. The ice groaned, not loud, but like a warning. I backed away, slow, careful, not wanting to panic. Halfway back, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting to see someone else out there, but there was nothing, just my own tracks, and beside them, a second set forming in real time. Each step matched mine perfectly, landing just behind, the ice dimpling as if pressed from below. I ran. I didn't think, didn't plan. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs shook, and I didn't stop until I reached solid ground. When I turned back, the second set of prints had stopped at the shoreline. They didn't come onto land. I reported it. Of course I did. They sent 2 men out later, and by then the lake looked normal. No footprints, no soft ice. They told me stress can make you see patterns, that storms do strange things. I didn't argue. I took a week off. When I went back to work, I checked the old records, digging through maintenance logs from the 1960s and 70s. There was an incident noted in pencil, barely legible. A worker named Carl had gone missing during a route check. His last location was marked at the exclusion zone. The note said his body was never recovered. The ice had closed. I started having dreams after that. I'd be walking across the lake, following footprints I knew were mine, and I could feel something pacing me underneath, waiting for me to stop. I stopped working the ice roads after that season. I moved closer to town, took a warehouse job. Years later, during a mild winter, I heard they were considering reopening part of the lake for traffic. The springs had supposedly cooled. I went out there one last time, just to see. There were no markers, no roads, just snow and ice. And near the center, faint but unmistakable, were footprints leading in and none leading out. I woke up because someone was tapping on the glass, slow and careful, like they didn't want to wake the whole dorm. I lifted my head from the pillow and looked straight at the window, and that's when I saw the snowman standing in the courtyard below room 4, facing my bed. I remember thinking it was too early for anyone to be building snowmen, especially during restricted hours. And I felt that tight feeling in my chest I used to get when I knew I'd done something wrong, but didn't know what. The snowman wasn't big or playful. It was about my height, packed tight, with no scarf or hat. Just 2 dark stones for eyes and a mouth that was a straight line. I lay there watching it, waiting for it to fall over or melt, or do anything that would make sense. It didn't move. When the morning bell rang, I told myself it was just a prank and got dressed. At breakfast I asked around, trying to sound casual, asking who'd been out early. Nobody said anything. A couple of kids laughed and said the storm must have made me dream it. When we came back after classes, the snowman was still there, right under my window. I stood closer to the glass, close enough that my breath fogged it, and I noticed the snow around it was smooth. No footprints. That bothered me more than the snowman itself. The next morning it was closer. Not by much, but enough that I noticed right away. I counted the steps from the wall in my head, because I liked numbers, and it was 3 steps closer than the day before. I told my roommate, and she rolled her eyes and said someone was messing with me. She said kids here did stuff like that all the time. Still, she looked uneasy when she saw it. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept listening for footsteps in the courtyard, but all I heard was the building settling and someone coughing down the hall. When I woke up, the snowman was closer again. I felt sick. It was almost directly under the window now. Close enough that I could see the uneven packing of the snow, the little cracks where it had been shaped by hands. I went to the staff office and told them. They took it seriously enough to check the security footage. I sat there watching the grainy screen with a counselor beside me, my hands shaking. The cameras showed the courtyard all night empty. No one came in, no one left. The snowman wasn't there at midnight, and then suddenly, between one frame and the next, it was standing there. Just appeared. The counselor paused the tape and said it must be a glitch. They moved me to a different room that afternoon, further down the hall. I packed my things and kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the snowman following me. That night, I slept better than I had in days, until morning. When I woke up, I saw it through the new window, standing directly outside, closer than it had ever been. I started crying then. I didn't try to hide it. Staff came running, and they argued quietly in the hallway while I sat on my bed staring at the glass. One of them suggested knocking it down. Another said they should wait for maintenance. They finally sent someone out in full winter gear. I watched as he walked across the courtyard, his boots leaving deep prints. He pushed the snowman over, and it broke apart easily, collapsing into a pile. I thought that was the end. I really did. But the next morning, it was back, rebuilt. Taller. This time its face was different. The stones were arranged in a way that looked like it was smiling. I screamed. I don't remember screaming. but people told me later I did. They called my parents and said I was having a stress reaction. I was sent home that afternoon. As we drove away, I looked back at the school at the courtyard, and I saw nothing. Just empty snow. Years passed. I grew up. I tried not to think about it. Then, after my father died, my mother gave me an old box of my things. Inside was a folded paper from the school. It was an incident report. It said that decades earlier, a child had gone missing from room 4 during winter break. The search ended when a snowman was found packed with clothing inside. I don't remember building any snowmen, but sometimes, when I wake up early in winter, I swear I can feel snow packed tight around my hands. I was logging the third dropped call of the hour when the radio crackled and said my name, not my call sign, not the channel identifier, just my name spoken clearly through the static. I froze with my pen halfway across the page, staring at the console as if it had betrayed me. The blackout had knocked out half our systems, and the auxiliary radios were supposed to be dead weight in this cold. But the red indicator light was glowing like it had never been unplugged. I pressed the talk button and asked who was calling, keeping my voice steady the way we're trained to do, even when our pulse is loud in our ears. The response came immediately, clipped and professional, the kind of voice you only hear from field patrols. He identified himself as Unit 7 and reported whiteout conditions near the old mining road. I felt a prickle of confusion because Unit 7 hadn't existed since before I joined dispatch. I checked the roster anyway, fingers stiff, and confirmed what I already knew. I told him there was no Unit 7 on active duty and asked him to repeat his identifier. There was a pause, long enough that I wondered if the signal had dropped. Then he said my name again and asked if the road markers were still visible. I swallowed and glanced at the map pinned to the wall, the one with faded annotations nobody used anymore. The mining road was crossed out in red. Decommissioned after a collapse years earlier. I told him to hold position and reached for my supervisor's number. But the phone was dead. The backup generator hummed unevenly, lights flickering. The radio hissed, then another voice broke in, this one higher, strained. Unit 12, reporting a stranded vehicle with no heat. Unit 12 was also gone, struck from the books after an incident nobody liked to talk about. I felt like I was listening to ghosts reading from an old manual. I asked them both to confirm their locations. They answered with coordinates that made my stomach tighten, points clustered around the abandoned sector. As they spoke, I noticed something else. Their voices weren't panicked. They were calm, methodical, like they were following procedure. That scared me more than shouting would have. The temperature display on the wall dipped lower, and frost crept along the inside edge of the window. I wrapped my hands around the radio, feeling its unnatural warmth. It shouldn't have been working at all. I asked Unit 7 how long he'd been on patrol. He hesitated, then said a date that made my chest ache. 2012, the year before the collapse. I told him there had been an accident that year, that the sector was closed, that no one was out there anymore. He didn't argue. He just said they'd been waiting for instructions. I realized then that none of them had asked for rescue. They were calling in like they always had, reporting conditions, trusting someone would answer. Another voice joined, then another. The channel filled with reports, overlapping but orderly, a roll call of units that no longer existed. I tried to shut the radio off. The switch wouldn't move. I unplugged it, and the voices continued, clear as breath in my ear. I thought about protocol, about not engaging with anomalous calls, but this wasn't in any manual. I imagined them out there, vehicles stalled, engines cold, waiting because that's what they were trained to do. I made a decision that still keeps me awake some nights. I told them to proceed south, toward the lights of town, even though the road wasn't safe. even though it hadn't been maintained in years. There was silence. Then Unit 7 acknowledged, thanked me, and said they were moving. One by one, the other units followed. The radio grew quiet. The indicator light dimmed, then went dark. When power came back hours later, the radio was a block of ice, useless and dead. Weeks later, a maintenance crew found tire tracks near the old mining road, half buried but unmistakable, leading toward town and stopping abruptly at the edge of the cleared highway. No vehicles, no bodies. The official report blamed thaw and refreeze cycles. I didn't argue. I still log calls the same way, but sometimes, when the lines are quiet, I swear I hear someone waiting for me to answer. I was unlocking the nursery door when I noticed the boot marks cutting through the fresh snow, and I stopped so fast my keys jingled loud in the quiet. The playground had been cleared the evening before, smooth and empty, and the storm had finished sometime in the night. What I was looking at now were adult boot prints, heavy and deliberate, circling the small fenced play area in a wide loop. I stood there longer than I should have, counting them without meaning to. They were too big to belong to any child, and too deep to be from someone just wandering past. They pressed down hard, heel first, like the person wearing them had weight and purpose. I told myself it was probably maintenance, even though maintenance never worked nights during storms, and I was the one who signed the log. I unlocked the door and went inside, shaking snow from my coat, but I couldn't stop thinking about those tracks. I checked the overnight log immediately. Only my name was there. I'd been the last adult to leave, locking the building just before the storm hit. No security patrols, no late arrivals, no emergencies. That was policy, especially with the road conditions. The children arrived one by one, bundled and loud, and for a while the normal routine pushed the worry down. I helped with boots, mittens, tears over missing toys. Still, every time I glanced toward the windows facing the playground, my chest tightened. The tracks were still there, unbroken, looping around the fence like something had been pacing. During morning playtime, one of the boys asked why someone had been walking around their swings in the dark. I told him it was probably an animal, and the lie tasted wrong the moment it left my mouth. Animals didn't wear boots. Animals didn't walk in perfect circles. I called the lodge manager. He sounded annoyed, said the storm must have confused me, said tracks can look strange after high winds. I asked him to come see for himself. He said he'd check later. I didn't like that answer, but there wasn't much I could do. When nap time came, I dimmed the lights and settled the children on their mats. As I moved between them, I kept listening for sounds outside, the crunch of snow, the scrape of a fence. There was nothing. The silence felt thick, pressing against my ears. I remember thinking it felt like someone was holding their breath. After lunch, I finally went back out. I wanted a closer look, wanted to prove to myself I was overreacting. The playground gate was still latched. The boot prints stayed outside the fence, never crossing in. They circled it exactly 3 times before stopping right in front of the gate, toes pointed inward. Like whoever stood there had been looking at the swings, I crouched and touched one of the prints. The edges were crisp, the snow packed solid. These hadn't been there long, but they weren't melting either. I followed the trail backward, expecting to find where they came from. They didn't lead to the road, or the lodge, or the woods. They simply began, right there, as if the person had stepped down out of the air. I went back inside shaking. I locked the door, even though we never did that during the day. I pulled the children away from the windows and started a story to distract them, my voice too fast. Halfway through, I realized something else was wrong. From inside, I could see more tracks now, closer to the fence than before. They hadn't been there minutes earlier. I felt that cold slide into my stomach. The kind that makes you lightheaded. I counted again. Another circle had been added, tighter than the rest. The idea that someone was out there, moving while I stood inside watching, made my skin crawl. I called the manager again and didn't wait for him to speak. I told him what I was seeing, that the tracks were changing. He went quiet, then said he was on his way. I watched from the hallway as the boot prints completed another slow loop, snow compressing without any visible body making it happen. The children started to notice. One of the girls asked who was playing outside. I told them all to stay put and close the blinds, my hands trembling so badly I struggled with the cord. The room felt smaller with the windows covered, like we were hiding. When the manager arrived, he saw the tracks immediately. I could tell by his face that he knew this wasn't normal. He didn't say much. He walked the perimeter, radio pressed to his ear, then came back inside and told me to keep the children occupied. Not long after, park security arrived. They photographed the playground, measured the prints, spoke in low voices. One of them finally told me the truth. Years before, a caretaker had been dismissed from the lodge after repeated warnings about inappropriate behavior around the nursery. He'd vanished during a winter storm. They never found him. The tracks stopped appearing after that day. The snow melted. The season ended. I quit before spring. Even now, when I see fresh snow around a playground, I look for circles, and I never stay long if I find them. I was halfway down the aisle scanning tickets when the device chirped and confirmed a valid fare from seat 22 by the window. And I remember stopping because I was staring directly at that seat, and it was empty. I lowered the scanner, looked again, and felt a strange flush crawl up my neck, as if I had embarrassed myself in front of the train. I checked the screen, expecting an error code, but the ticket number, route, and boarding confirmation were all there, logged as used moments earlier. I asked the nearest passenger if someone had been sitting there and stepped aside to let them answer, already forming an explanation in my head about double bookings or delayed boarding. The woman shook her head and said the seat had been empty since Samadan, and her tone made it clear she wasn't joking. I crouched and touched the cushion without thinking. It was warm, like someone had just stood up, and that made my stomach tighten in a way I didn't like. I stood and told myself heat lingers, that train's trap warmth, that I was tired. Then I noticed the floor. Beneath seat 22, snow had melted into a small, uneven puddle, soaking into the carpet. Not tracked in, not scattered, but pooled straight down, as if it had fallen from above. I looked at the window. It was sealed, dry, no sign of being opened. My chest felt tight, and I suddenly became aware of how quiet that section of the carriage was. I radioed the driver and reported a ticket anomaly, keeping my voice neutral. He asked if there was an unseated passenger. I said no, and felt foolish saying it out loud. He told me to note it and continue checks. Protocol didn't cover warm seats and melting snow. I wiped my hand on my coat and moved on, but I kept glancing back, half expecting to see someone there when I wasn't looking. At the next stop, no one boarded. The doors opened and closed on swirling white, and when we moved again, the scanner chirped once more from the same seat. Same ticket, same confirmation. I felt my heart thud hard enough to hurt. I turned slowly, like I might spook something, and there it was again, empty seat, warm cushion, fresh snow dripping down in slow, deliberate drops. This time I knelt and pressed my palm flat, holding it there longer than before. It wasn't just warm. It felt alive, like the warmth you feel when someone sits close enough that you can sense their body through fabric. I pulled my hand away and wiped it again, breathing shallow. A man across the aisle asked if everything was all right. I told him there was a system issue and asked him to move seats. He did, watching me the way people do when they think you're hiding bad news. I blocked off the row and stood there, watching. The snow kept appearing, not falling, Just forming, soaking in, disappearing, then forming again. I checked the manifest and traced the ticket number back to a name. It belonged to a man reported missing earlier that winter, last seen boarding a regional line during a storm. I remembered the notice vaguely, a face on a board we all passed without stopping. I felt cold then, deep in my bones. I told the driver I needed to stop the train. He argued, said the line ahead was clear enough, that delays would strand us. I insisted. When we stopped, I walked back alone, scanner in hand, and spoke toward the seat like I would to any passenger, asking for a ticket check. The scanner chirped in my hand, right on cue. I said his name, quietly. The warmth intensified, the snow pooled faster, and for a moment I smelled wet wool and metal. I told him he hadn't boarded, that the train couldn't carry him anymore. The scanner went silent, the warmth faded. The snow stopped forming. We arrived without further incident. Later, maintenance replaced the carpet. The ticket was removed from the system. I still check seats twice now, and when the scanner chirps, I always look up before I look down. I was already waist, deep in packed snow, when someone shouted that they'd found tracks. And I remember feeling relief before I felt fear, because tracks meant movement, and movement meant hope. I climbed out of the pit we'd been probing and followed the line uphill, my legs heavy, my breath loud in my ears. The prints were clear, pressed deep, leading away from the slide zone instead of into it, which didn't make sense, but didn't stop me from following. They were boot prints, adult size, good tread, spaced evenly like the person had been walking calmly, not panicking, not running from an avalanche that should have taken him without warning. I remember thinking how strange it was that he'd had time to walk at all. We'd been told he disappeared fast, one moment visible, the next gone. Avalanches don't usually leave time for neat steps. We followed the trail for maybe 20 meters before it stopped, not at a drop or a tree, just stopped in an open patch. No scuffing, no collapse, no sign of being buried again. I knelt and brushed snow aside, expecting to find a depression or a hole. There was nothing, just solid ground and cold silence. That's when someone behind me said they'd found the body. He was downhill, half exposed, face turned to the side like he'd laid down to rest. We moved fast then, careful but urgent, checking for signs of life, even though we all knew it was too late. I took his legs, another volunteer took his shoulders, and we lifted him onto the sled. As we did, I noticed his socks. He wasn't wearing boots. I said it out loud before I could stop myself. It sounded stupid the moment it left my mouth, but everyone froze anyway. His feet were wrapped in thick wool socks, dry and clean, no tears, no ice clinging to them. I stared at them, my mind struggling to make it fit. You don't walk through snow like that without boots. You don't leave prints. We searched around the body, thinking maybe they'd come off in the slide, but there were no boots nearby. No scuffs where they'd been pulled off, no straps, nothing. Just the prints up above, clear as a photograph, leading nowhere. Back at the staging area, someone produced the boots. They'd been found earlier, closer to where he'd vanished. I watched as they were set down in the snow, side by side, laces tied. They were clean, dry, not a fleck of snow inside them. I picked one up and felt the warmth inside, faint but unmistakable, like it had just been taken off. I remember feeling sick then, a slow rolling nausea that had nothing to do with exhaustion. I kept replaying the prints in my head, the spacing, the calmness. I asked the team lead how that was possible. He told me not to think about it, said avalanches do strange things, that trauma confuses memory. But this wasn't memory. This was right in front of us. Later, when the official report was being filled out, I insisted the detail be included. Missing boots, clean socks, unexplained tracks. The officer writing it paused, then quietly crossed that part out. He said it would only upset the family. I didn't argue. I didn't know how. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those prints ending in empty snow. I kept thinking about the boots, sitting there like they were waiting. Around dawn, I gave up and went outside, walking the edge of the village where the snow was still untouched. I found more prints. They came from the direction of the mountain, same tread, same spacing, leading toward town. This time, I followed them all the way to the edge of the road, where they stopped beside a bench. On the bench were the boots, placed neatly, toes pointing out, laces still tied. I didn't touch them. I called it in, my voice shaking. When someone came to retrieve them, they didn't ask questions. They just picked them up and drove away. The prints never appeared again. Officially, the man died where he was found. The boots were listed as recovered personal effects. I stayed on the team for one more season, then quit. Even now, when I walk in fresh snow, I look down at my own tracks, making sure my boots are still on my feet. I was shoveling the last drift away from the garage door when the metal edge of the shovel struck something flat and solid that wasn't concrete, and the sound jolted straight up my arms. I scraped again, slower this time, and exposed a rectangular outline buried under packed snow and ice, set perfectly flush into the floor. I stood there breathing hard, staring at it, already knowing this wasn't on any maintenance plan I'd ever signed off on. I knelt and brushed the surface clear with my gloves. It was a door, not wood, not metal I recognized, just a pale surface that looked almost white stone, smooth and unmarked except for a recessed handle. My first thought was a storage hatch, maybe something the original builders forgot to document. My second thought, that it shouldn't have been directly under where cars parked. Nothing should be. I tried the handle. It resisted for a moment, then came free with a dry sound that made my teeth ache. Cold air rushed up immediately, sharper than the cold I'd been working in, like opening a freezer that had been sealed too long. I leaned back on instinct, my heart hammering, then forced myself to look down. A narrow set of steps descended into a white room. I don't mean white like painted. I mean white like ice, every surface pale and reflective, swallowing depth. I could see my breath spill down into it. What stopped me wasn't the cold, though. It was the footprints. Fresh ones. Bare feet, small, leading away from the bottom of the stairs and curving along the wall, disappearing behind a corner I couldn't yet see. I stood there a long time, telling myself there was an explanation, that maybe kids had gotten in somehow, that maybe I was misreading shadows. But the prints were clear, toes and heels pressed into frost. Someone had been down there recently. Someone without shoes. I called out. My voice came back flat, wrong. Like it didn't know where to go. No answer. I considered closing the door and calling it in, but the idea of sealing someone inside, if they were still there, made my chest tighten. Against my better judgment, I stepped down. The cold hit instantly, seeping through my boots, climbing my legs. The air smelled clean, almost sterile, with a faint mineral edge. The walls weren't wet, weren't melting. They held the cold perfectly. I followed the footprints, my own steps echoing too loudly, feeling like I was intruding on something that had been waiting to be left alone. The room wasn't large, but it bent in a way that made it hard to judge distance. Corners felt closer than they were. The footprints looped around the perimeter, never crossing the center. I realized then there was no frost disturbance anywhere else. Just that single path, repeated, paced. In the far corner, I found a second door, smaller, sealed shut. The prints stopped directly in front of it. I reached out, my fingers numb, and touched the surface. It was warmer there, just slightly, like skin under ice. I pulled my hand back and felt panic surge, sharp and sudden. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw the new prints. They overlapped the old ones, fresher, leading back toward the stairs. I hadn't heard anyone pass me. The room was silent except for my breathing, now fast and loud. I ran. I didn't look back. I took the steps 2 at a time, slammed the door shut, and dragged the shovel across it like that would do anything. I stood there shaking until my legs gave out. I reported it that afternoon. Inspectors came. They opened the door. The room was there, but empty. No footprints, no frost disturbed. Just a white space and a sealed inner door that refused to open. Old records turned up eventually. The property had been used briefly in the 1940s as cold storage for recovered remains from a nearby accident. The room was sealed when they couldn't identify them all. They filled it with concrete a week later. I watched. When it was done, I thought I saw damp footprints leading away from the garage, melting as I stared. I quit that job before winter ended. Even now, when I park over concrete, I wonder what's beneath my feet, waiting for the cold to come back.